I have another returner, Philip Craici. Last time we talked about the Wild West and what made it wild and not so wild. And today we're going to talk about
Men's clothing.
yes. All right.
Totally different, yet slightly similar.
Okay. So you told me that you had a historical clothing endeavor of some sort.
That's right. One of my projects is reproducing men's vintage clothing from approximately the year 1899 to about the year 1920.
Okay. So, why particularly that era, that time period?
Well, it's the answer to that is twofold. First reason is because I personally find it to be the most interesting and exciting period of men's clothing. And two, because it's one of the least provided. There are lots of other kind of vintage reproduction companies out there, but almost none of them do this particular period. So it's a niche that really has not gotten a lot of attention, and I wanted to give it the attention that I thought it deserved.
Excellent. Good for you. Good for you on embarking on that.
Thanks.
So, what kind of period are we talking about between 1899 and 1920?
Well, we're talking about the end of the Victorian era. And although Victorian is a very British temponym, uh, chrononym. I don't know how you would say, name for a period of time. That would probably be the Gilded Age for America. Um, the end of that period and the beginning of what in America we call the Progressive period or the Edwardian period in England. It was a time of massive technological, social change, political change in the Western world, and it is the beginnings of what we see. It's the beginning of the standards of men's clothing that we see today. There are things that are found from that period that wouldn't look out of place in a men's store nowadays. And in some ways, almost nothing has changed. In some ways, things have changed dramatically. And it is those similarities and those changes that I think are part of why it's such a special and interesting period.
Okay. Okay. That's all right. So let's get started with talking about the transition as to why. Well, first off, let's start with the name before we even get talking about the transition between the Victorian and the Edwardian era. Why was it called the Edwardian era?
It was called the Edwardian era, particularly in England, because that is who the king was. King Edward VII became the King of England in 1901 with the death of Queen Victoria. Uh, Queen Victoria reigned for many, many decades, the longest, one of the longest reigning monarchs in history. And her heir was Edward VII, and he reigned from 1901 to 1910 or 1909, when King George became the king. But when you're talking about the style of, when you're talking about the period, some people extend it past 1910. They say it covers from 1901 to about 1912 or the beginning of World War One in 1914. So it's kind of that. But I extended even further, a little bit further to the end of the First World War, because there's just more interesting things to kind of include in there, and I think they all kind of followed. They were all kind of connected by something, and really the main thing is detachable collars. That's one thing that's really the only thing that kind of goes to the whole thing. During this time period, most men's shirts did not come with a collar attached. They were detached, and you had to switch them out and button them on. And regardless of what was going on, you found the same thing in 1920 as you did in 1901.
Okay. Well, fun facts. I didn't even know about the 1920s as detachable collars.
That's right. Yeah, and that's something that kind of faded away in the 1920s in America, at least. Although many old-fashioned British men continued to wear them even into the 1960s. And actually, nowadays, detachable collars are still part of the uniform for British judges and clergy.
Okay. Well, that's pretty cool. I'm gonna next time I go to Britain, I'm gonna want to try and get to a British church and
Yeah,
find a
but
detachable
British shirt
collar.
shop. That's right. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think really that maybe that's why I include all the way up until then, because there's some interesting styles that you see towards 1920. But really, the only thing that connects that period entirely with the beginning of the period I want to cover is the fact that there were detachable collars. So to me, that's enough continuity to include that all in my mission statement.
Excellent. Okay. So we start. Okay, so it starts out as the Victorian era, and a lot of us know it as kind of a time period where people were wearing collars, kind of like what I'm having right now. And I don't know what the proper term for it is. These shorter, non-folding out collars, like what you're wearing. Um,
Right. Yeah. So the around around the end of the 1800s or beginning of the 1900s, what was called the imperial collar was extremely popular. That was a little bit more extreme even than what you have on. It was a detachable collar. I actually have one upstairs. I don't want to cut this thing short because I could show you all sorts of stuff. But it was basically one big piece of fabric that came around the neck and almost looked like it was kind of holding your head up. And it was very restrained and it was very stiff and it projected an air of regality and restraint and elegance that a lot of men wanted to project at the time.
cool. Yeah, so we also had vests at that time,
That's right.
very fancy vests. And were there particular unique prints during the Victorian era?
Oh, there were more prints than you could even say. It was the funny thing is that the Victorian era is kind of thought of as a very dour, conservative, um, colorless period. We think of black suits and gray, black and gray and white, essentially being the main kind of colors. You know, men wanted to be, and that was very popular. Men wanted to show that they were not too frivolous and too foppish and too dandyish like they had in the previous generation of style around the Regency era, where you see lots of frilly this and that and silk and greens and pinks and purples. Um, but while that was true of the Victorian time, there was also tons of patterns, especially for vests. If you wanted to, especially if you wanted to show off a little bit of personality, you would wear a dark jacket, kind of either gray or fawn, uh, or buff, kind of tannish uh, trousers, and then you would wear this very elaborate waistcoat, and it came in checks, it came in plaids, floral designs, things that we would consider to be psychedelic even now by nowadays standards, something you would see out of the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
That was considered very desirable at that time.
And was that also in the 1960s? A lot of hippies were going to vintage stores and they were going thrift shopping and collecting those kinds of items.
They were I think they were inspired. I think that with the hippie thing was more inspired by trying to break away from what was basically the dourness of the 1950s. Again, there was this, the kind of the man in the gray flannel suit was the kind of image. That was a Gregory Peck movie, I think.
Mhm.
That was the very standard image for the professional suburban man of the 1950s, and so in the 60s they wanted to rebel against that by going all out with tons of color and tons of patterns. And I'm not sure if it's connected necessarily to the Victorian era, but I can say that during the 60s there was, oddly enough, an Edwardian style revival, especially that started in England, where they started wearing four-button suits and bowler hats and very small kind of thin ties, and so there was a lot of calling back to the past in many different ways.
Okay. Interesting. So getting back to the Victorian era a little bit, so this was a time period where people had been wearing kind of like extravagant outfits by today's standards, top hats, uh, coat tails, things of that
Right.
nature. And then there was this big jump where people start changing those outfits. So what happened to cause a big shift in these kinds of clothes? Why did men start dressing differently? What helped kick it off?
Well, the standard formal day dress in the Victorian era was a frock suit or a morning suit. It was a, like you say, it was a cutaway jacket with usually striped pants and a vest that either matched the jacket or that was its own kind of design. And like you said, a top hat or a derby or some sort of more kind of, or Homburg, some sort of formal hat. Um, and there was a gradual shift away from that being, because what we have to talk when it comes to fashion nowadays, we are talking totally different than fashion culture of before times. Nowadays, everybody can kind of do what they want. They can kind of express however they want, and as long as it's okay by their workplace dress code standards, they can pretty much wear whatever they want. But in the Victorian and into the Edwardian period, there were certain things that were appropriate and things that were inappropriate, and there were things you could wear and that you could not wear. And when you're talking about formal daytime business activities, what I just described was the main thing: a dark coat, striped slacks, and the vest with a top hat or some other more formal hat. But over time, the sense of what was considered formal began to change, and what became it became gradually and gradually more allowable to wear what we think nowadays is very formal, but what at that point was actually considered very casual, which was the three-piece suit. So a suit jacket and a matching vest and trousers. That, for during the 1800s, was actually considered a kind of, they called it a lounge coat or a lounge suit. So when you're not out doing stuff for the business firm, or if you're not conducting your official duties as part of your job, and you were just at home relaxing, you could take a breather and relax and wear a three-piece suit. And gradually, men started to desire to just wear that in general, and they started to wear it. They started to wear it to work. They started to wear it to places that they were not considered appropriate for before. And it was this, and I personally think that it was just people getting used to one thing and just thinking, well, why don't I just keep this on, and for these other events? Why, if I can wear it at home, why shouldn't I wear it to the office? And while that was happening, there were still certain things that were considered appropriate to wear for very formal. If you were going to go to a wedding during the day, you still had to wear the frock suit or the cutaway morning suit. And if you were going out to a fancy dinner, you still had to wear a white tie and tails with an opera coat. So those things really didn't change for the most formal events, but there was this sense of blurriness when it came to business functions, and especially in America, where we were always trying to buck the trends, and we always wanted to kind of do our own thing, and we wanted to say, well, why shouldn't we try things a different way? And so, especially in America, you saw this loosening of conventions, and people started to wear what was considered a very casual outfit for more formal functions, and that's where the change began.
Okay.
Sorry, that was quite a screed. You can
Yeah,
tell I'm
no,
pretty
well, it was an
pumped.
interesting screen. All
But
right.
that's really part of it. It's the sense of what is considered appropriate and what's considered inappropriate. And
Mhm.
there were still things that you could not do. Obviously, you couldn't walk around with your shirt exposed. You couldn't just walk around with no vest and no jacket. That was actually considered extremely rude. It'd be like one of us walking around in our boxer shorts at the supermarket, because the shirt was considered underwear at the time. But extreme examples like that aside, there was a sense that maybe we can loosen up our standards.
Okay. So, not to give people a graphic image, but was this a time when people were still technically wearing a shift? Which, for people at home that don't know, that was for the longest time, it was just this very long shirt that was your undershirt, your underwear.
Right, right. So they would have just called it a they would for men they would have called it a shirt. And it actually had a very it was very similar to that. It was kind of tunic like. It was very long. It reached down to the thighs, and it was very oversized by today's standards. But the idea was that it didn't really matter if your shirt fit close to your body because nobody's going to see it anyway, except for maybe a little bit around your neck area or your cuffs. Um, and so yeah, you would wear that. It kind of looked like a nightshirt by today's standards, but that was considered a shirt, and that was your basic undergarment. Uh, and you put over that your vest and your jacket, and covering up most of it. So yeah, that in a way was the standard.
Okay. So, this was still a time where you had not necessarily a shift, but you had a shirt that was still your undershirt. So I'm kind of curious why all of a sudden people started putting on attachable collars.
Well, there was so let's begin with the reason for why they started to do detachable collars, because attached collar shirts came before. But
Hmm.
what happened was in the 1820s, um, this company this company got this idea from this woman whose her husband was a blacksmith, and he would wear a white shirt to his blacksmith job every single day. And what he wanted to make sure that it was clean and crisp every single day, and that of course put a huge amount of strain on his wife because women were expected to be the ones doing the laundry. And to save time, what she would do is she cut the collar off of his shirt and just washed that every day, and then had it attached on via some sort of buttons or other attachment, so that it presented the appearance of having been fully laundered every single time he wore it. And that idea caught on. And so gradually over the from 1820 into the 1860s and 70s, you saw more people going towards the idea of wearing a shirt with a detachable collar, which you can switch out for another clean one or just launder it. But you don't have to wash the actual shirt itself very frequently. So you present a cleaner image to the world with less work. And this led to an explosion in different types of shirts and different types of collars. There were detachable cuffs, and this became the default way to wear a day shirt. And it presented, and if as you can imagine, it's a little bit more work. You can't just pull on your shirt and then you're good. You have to pull on your shirt, and then you have to get your little collar studs, and you have to fit it through the front part, and you got to fit it through a little sleeve on the back part, and you got to make sure you attach it. And if it's a fold down collar, you have to open it in a certain way so you can slide your tie underneath, but not too much because otherwise you might tear your tie. These were problems people had every single day. And I think over the course of several decades, gradually people started to say, you know what, I think maybe this is more work than it's worth. And so for work shirts frequently came with collars attached because you didn't really have to worry about having it look perfectly clean all the time. But I think over time, people started realizing that this is just a lot of extra work. And then World War One happened, and World War One was the big event that changed everything because with World War One, men going into the army were issued their shirts, and they became used to the idea of just slipping on the shirt that already had a collar and putting on the tie, and voila, you're done. And when men left the army after the war, they kept this affinity for a soft attached collar shirt that meant you could get up, put everything on, and be out the door and not have to worry about extra little bits and bobs and putting stuff in. That I think was the main catalyst for that change.
Didn't really think about that. A detachable collar, and then World War I happens, and it's all that's when quick and efficiency kicks into place.
Yeah, because maybe also, men coming home from the war realized, like, you know what, I may not have much time left on this earth. I don't want to waste it. I don't want to spend 2 hours getting ready every morning. I want to get out and go and do my and live my life. I don't want to spend a lot of extra time on this,
Yeah,
on simply getting dressed in the mornings. Maybe that's just one possibility.
could be. Could very well be. That's an interesting thought process when people do come back from war. There's a lot of things that they really don't think about, or people who go through extreme situations.
Yeah, and it changed, especially when a war like World War One, where so many millions of people were involved, millions of people died. It was that kind of thing can't help but change whole societies, whole cultures. Um, One other thing that is part of the problem too is the fact that by the early 1900s, the detachable collars men were wearing had become so uncomfortable and rigid that I think comfort just became something that people were thinking more about, because the detachable collars themselves had become softer by the time World War One came. So when World War One came along and men got used to this new way of dressing, it probably just finished it off. But it was already tending in that direction. There was actually a story of a man who who was wearing a stiff detachable collar that kind of came up to his chin basically, and he fell asleep on it, and it cut off the circulation to his head, and he died in his sleep. So that's the kind of danger that you ran into. So that's kind of that's where things had gone to in the name of showing off a clean, stiff, starched image. That's the kind of thing that could happen to you. So I don't know. I think that changed a lot of people's minds when things like that would
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, wow, wow. All right, it takes
happen. Oh yeah.
fashion to a whole new extreme.
Oh yes. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. It's but also, style doesn't, and these are all just suppositions. These are all, any of them could be true and any of them can be false, because the truth is we're not always sure why fashions change. There's always things that could influence things, and and it could be any number of reasons, or it could be some reason totally different than what I said. But these are just based on the research I've done. This is what I would say had led to these changes.
All right. I mean, some of these stories and this information all seems pretty compelling.
It certainly would compel me.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely seems to make a lot of sense. I mean, also, by the sounds of it too, with the Edwardian, from the Victorian to the Edwardian, I don't know if this is true or not, but I had heard from another friend of mine who um, owns a store called Emporium 32 down in Salem. My friend Nick, he had talked about that people would have clothes that they would wear in the morning, or clothes that they would wear to work, and then there would be clothes that you would wear at night. So
That's right.
yeah,
Yeah,
so
you wouldn't.
some people would wear like a gray suit, or it was a standard for a gray suit. I can't quite remember. So hopefully I'm not being hopefully people are not taking my word as law. And then in the evening, you would switch over to black, go from gray to black in a day. And some of these things were like very expected. It was sort of these ridiculous expectations of what people were wearing.
Right. Yeah, and that's absolutely part of it. Evening dress was totally different from morning or day dress. And if you wore a white tie and tails during the day, people would sneer at you and laugh at you. Like, why would you wear that? But once 5 or 6 p.m. hits and the sun starts to go down, if you were not wearing white tie and tails, or around 1910, at the very, very least, a tuxedo with a black tie, people would say, "Why are you still wearing your day clothes? You should be changed into evening wear now." It's yeah, those were the kind of expectations people had back then. Very rigid.
Yeah. So I can also too see how the clothing is reflecting the attitude shift, where people are loosening up a bit on what kind of clothes to wear, um, which is kind of funny. It makes me think about how, like in the medieval era, there would be these ridiculous laws surrounding like you're not supposed to make cheese on Sunday.
Right. Yeah.
And seeing in the Victorian era, where funny enough, they actually do have an influence on mostly through their art, how they viewed earlier time periods, like in America, the 1800s depictions of the Salem witch trials, thinking that they were
Mm.
so barbaric and primitive and irrational, and yet here they are carrying these kind of crazy double standards about clothing.
Right. Well, if you're talking about someone of the 1800s, they are as far in history as anyone has ever been. They're at the cutting edge, and those barbarians of 200 years ago or 300 years ago, yeah, they didn't know what they were talking about. Now, of course, we have our standards, but we're not insane like the Puritans of the early colonial American colonies. To them, yeah, the standards always changed. And 200 years from now, people are probably going to look back at people in our time period and say, "Man, why did they have so many rules that we don't even consider these things to be rules anymore? Why would we follow those? Why did they act like that?" So I think every generation probably looks down on the previous ones.
Yeah, makes makes sense. Makes sense with some of the changes. So we do have like in the Edwardian era this shift, like things are becoming looser, things are loosening up. Um, what are so we get three-piece suits. It becomes sort of like okay for people to start wearing three-piece suits. What about other things with men that were shifting at this time period?
Uh, Culturally or with
Fashionably.
fashionably, well, you saw the rise of sports and sportswear. That was a big thing that started toward the end of the 1800s. Was it became more and more expected for men to be outgoing and outside and doing physical things, playing tennis, playing golf, riding horses, shooting, hunting. These were all outdoor pursuits, but you couldn't just go outside in any old thing. You had to have a specific type, you had to have a suit for that. So you saw new fashions. You saw things called Norfolk suits, which kind of have a belt in the front and um, some extra seams that make them much more. You wouldn't see those in a workplace. There were men. You've probably seen those pants that kind of go down to your knees and then kind of get tucked into really long socks, knickerbockers. Sometimes people call them, or plus fours or plus eights. You'll actually still find those things at some British shops because they have a lot of tradition. Because that became traditional hunting wear, especially. And you also see more people wearing different types of sweaters. Sweaters really were something. It was kind of like a workwear. You would wear a sweater when you were out chopping wood, or when you were out doing some sort of manual labor, but it wasn't something you would wear in polite society. But more and more, um, but the sweater represented an alternative to the suit jacket, which at times could be heavy and very high, rigidly constructed to present a sort of silhouette. If you wanted to have a little bit more freedom of movement, you could put on a sweater instead when you're going out and playing golf or playing um, cricket or croquet or tennis or whatever sport you're playing. Um, so those are some examples of what you would see. And toward the very, very, very end of the period that we're talking about, you start to see tennis shoes, which were brand new. Uh, and in fact, I think Keds was the one of the first companies that ever made that in the 19 teens during World War One. That period, you saw the first rubber basketball shoe or the first rubber tennis shoe, and it looked almost identical to high top Converse.
All right. That's awesome.
So like I said, there's a lot of things. That's partly why I find this period so interesting, is because there are so many connections from that period to what we still consider to be things that look good, more so than other periods. You know, a frock coat and a top hat, those will always, for us, look a little bit too conservative and costumey. But the fact that you can wear a turtleneck and high top sneakers and you know, a slim pair of wool pants and a hat like this, and that's something that is allowable today and 130 years ago, to me is incredible.
Yeah, that is incredible, and it's some of it is still pretty common fashion, actually.
It is, and you know, some people kind of push it a little bit, like myself. Sometimes I get a little bit, but I have to represent my company, so I typically do dress up in a slightly more Edwardian way. But I want to show that, you know, there are ways you can add a bit of vintage Edwardian and Victorian dress into what you wear, ways that some might say are even imperceptible. They might not even notice, but it's a fun way to play with history in the current day. Well, I it's called the Southworth Tailoring Company, and because I personally loved the way that men dressed in Edwardian times, and I, you know, would look around for specific necktie styles or specific shirts or specific jackets, and it was very hard to find good, high quality reproductions of that type of clothing. And originals, if you can find them, either are in such bad condition that they can't be worn, or very few people nowadays can wear them because people back then were quite small. And speaking as someone who's 6'4", it is very difficult to find, you know, big and tall sizes from, you know, the turn of the century. So you know, I started an account on Instagram called Edwardian Men, Edwardian underscore men, where I post images that I find of, you know, examples of men's culture and fashion from the time period we're talking about. And there's a huge community of people that love that stuff. And I thought, well, if there's other people out there like me and I can't find this type of clothing out there, then, well, hey, why don't I start? You know, so I began by offering a couple of period men's necktie styles that are made from 100% silk and cut in the unique patterns that they were done at that time. They didn't look like modern day neckties. They were much shorter and they had um, more interesting cuts. They had unique cuts. Some of them were very slim. Some of them were, you know, flared out to a big, wide, and fat front blade. And these were things that I thought were just cool and funky, and I wanted to reproduce them. So I started with those, and we got a little bit of traction. And then I realized maybe there's more we could do. So I started reaching out to different factories and mills and seeing, you know, who could create the type of stuff that we want to. And after a couple of trials, we ended up with first a suit, and then another type of suit, and then a jacket, and then a waistcoat, and now we're finally moving into sweaters and men's shirts as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Philip. The links are going to be below to check it out. Do you have anything for future generations you'd like to say?
Future generations. Don't judge us because we didn't know that we're one day going to be in the past.